Good evening.
Good evening.
Very nice. Thank you. I'm Allison Jablonski. I'm the Provost and VP for Academic Affairs. And welcome to the University Lecture Series this evening. It was founded in 2018 upon our becoming a university, and it features scholars and experts from the University of Lynchburg and celebrates their roles as educators, mentors, and researchers who make an impact on our campus and beyond. And we're so happy to invite our entire campus community as well as Lynchburg community to come and learn from their fascinating insights. Today we acknowledge the Monacan Indian Nation as the traditional stewards of the land on which the University of Lynchburg now sits, and we offer our respect to the Monacan people, past, present, and emerging. Our speaker this evening is David Gosling. He is an active professional counselor, an assistant professor of counselor education here at the university, and the clinical coordinator of clinical experiences here. He completed his doctorate in counselor education and supervision from William & Mary, and his Master of Science in clinical mental health counseling from Loyola University of Maryland. David previously served in the U.S. Army as an enlisted artillery forward observer, and later as an infantry officer for 8 years, and he is a combat veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom, where he fought with the 10th Mountain Division in and around Baghdad between 2006 and 2008. David also served as a Rhode Island State Trooper, the Director of Community Engagement for Got Your Six, a national nonprofit dedicated to serving our nation's veterans, and as a wilderness field instructor with Hurricane Island Outward Bound School. David is a graduate of the U.S. Army Air Assault, Airborne, and Ranger Schools, was the Distinguished Military Graduate of the University of Colorado Class of 2004, and was the honor graduate of the 2009 Rhode Island State Police Training Academy. I'm not sure what he hasn't done, honestly. In his free time, he can be found in the woods, planting vegetables, reading books, and playing with his 3-year-old daughter, Miriam. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gosling.
Thanks so much. Really happy to be here tonight to talk to y'all a little bit. It's a heavy subject matter, and I have a light hand with things, so my students who are here know I tend to use humor a lot, so there'll be a lot of that in the presentation. And this is what we're going to do. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about storytelling and narrative, because that's the methodology that I use with my research. The military experience, we'll get to moral injury eventually, about 80 slides in. The narrative study that I did for my dissertation a few years ago, and then hopefully some time for questions and answers with everybody. So, storytelling in the narrative inquiry model. To involve people at the deepest level, you need stories. That's by Harvard, so you know it's true. I kind of was hoping it was by Maya Angelou, so I got one from her too. There's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. What is storytelling and how does it work on us? I found it interesting to look at the neuroscience of it and realize that storytelling actually activates mirror neurons, which a lot of us now know are kind of a buzz term in the world the last couple of decades, and that's when your brain cells begin to fire when you're watching somebody do something versus you actually doing it. It's this kind of an equivalency. That's why sports are actually the opiate of the masses, not religion, because people are watching the sports and their brains are activating as if they themselves are playing the sports. So that actually happens in storytelling. That's part of how storytelling affects us. And that's part of why I love the narrative inquiry model. Fun fact, that was learned by accident by a group of Italian researchers who were studying macaques, pictured here. One of the researchers was on break eating like a banana, and the macaque was looking at it, and they realized all the sensors were going off as if the macaque itself was eating the banana. So, and then a fun fact about macaques is on Wikipedia, they're listed as a genus of gregarious old world monkey, which I'm hoping my fiance puts on my tombstone one day. Gregarious old world monkey. So there's no greater power on this earth than story. And as such, the narrative inquiry model is a really useful form of research for us. It's the study of experience, a story, and it's where narrative is both the phenomenon and the method that we use to look at the research. It's an actual form of qualitative research. It's legitimate. Here are some of the other ones. For example, phenomenology is probably the best known. Ethnography, you could think of Jane Goodall with her work with the chimpanzees. Grounded theory, a popular example would be Brene Brown, for instance. But the narrative inquiry model is one of the 6 forms of qualitative research. And you could kind of think of it a little bit like quantitative research is putting all of the details in the picture, and then qualitative research is giving it color. It's an analogy I like to use. And then narrative inquiry model is actually like filling in just the tiny little corners. Like if you have a kid and they can't quite get the corners, or not at all get the corners, then it's the narrative inquiry models filling in those little human footnotes, the human stories, the individual stories. I'm interested in individual human stories and what they mean, both as a counselor, as a professor, and as a researcher. So you could think of some qualitative methodologies as looking through a peephole, for instance, and you're bracketing the researcher away from the research. You're saying, okay, we're going to admit that they have some kind of influence on the research, but we're going to try to keep them out of it as much as possible. The narrative inquiry model is suggesting you're in the room. We're not going to say you're not in the room. So you're there, you're having a conversation with the participants themselves as you're going through that experience. So for me to do veteran research as a veteran, I don't have to say I'm going to bracket out my veteran experiences and not bring those to the space. I get to actually speak to people, veteran to veteran, about our experiences together. So if they have post-traumatic stress disorder, I get to say, well, I'm going to be over here looking at the door, so I understand what you're talking about. And if they talk about traumatic brain injury, I can say, well, there's complete years of my life that I don't remember, so we can talk about that. Or if they have moral injury, for instance, I can talk about some of my experiences of moral injury during the war, and we can relate on a human level. And that kind of research resonates for me because it opens them up to a shared human experience that's not available in all forms of research. All forms of research are valid. This just happens to be the one that works best for me. So I'm already telling you stories, and that's the narrative inquiry model, and that's the methodology. So I'm telling stories about my life, and I'm also suggesting stories of other people's lives. And you're also telling yourself stories as we go. And that's the beauty of it. You get to make your own story of whatever I'm saying. I'm not telling you how to make your story. It's the threads that you can weave together for yourself and for your own narrative. And if you think about it, the only thing we really know as counselors is eventually you're going to have to make sense of it some way. You'll put it together some way for yourself, however that looks, because we can't stay in cognitive dissonance. Everybody knows that in the clinical mental health world. And it's kind of like the massage chairs in the mall. You used to put a quarter in, but I think now it's like $100 probably. But you put in the money, and it goes really, really fast, and it feels really good for a minute, and then you get tired and you get out, and some gross little kid takes your seat, but that's okay. You had to get out of the seat, right? So the material that I'm presenting to you, it might not be a thing that you find, completely malleable at first, but eventually you'll make sense of it in your own way, and you'll process it and put it into your data bank. So why do I do talks like this? I think it demonstrates the power of narrative and storytelling. I find it fun and entertaining to talk to people like this, and it models the complexity of the narrative inquiry model and methodology. So telling stories is a powerful form of not just emotional resonance, but teaching and learning as well. So we all learn through storytelling, and whether or not we realize it, we're all the protagonists in our own stories. So it is very interesting for me to hear how other people become the protagonists in their own stories. And then I'm going to tell you a story about me. The Myers-Briggs is a personality inventory, and I don't think there's any psychologists here, so they're not going to light me on fire. But it's not super valid or reliable, but that's not really the point of the story. The point of the story is that I was asked to take this inventory when I was a young infantry lieutenant. And it's loosely based on Jungian archetypes. That's this young, not this young. And my commander, who was a guy named Captain Phillips, who was not this guy, but a different Captain Phillips, at the 10th Mountain Division, asked me to kind of take this inventory because he said all all the commanders are asking their young infantry officers to take this inventory. And guess what? 95% of them end up being this one type of person, this one type of the 16 types. So we want all of you to take it, and you don't have a choice, right? So you're going to take it. And before we talk about that, this is what the 10th Mountain Division looks like. According to the Army, this is what it actually looks like. And then moving past that, we need to talk a little bit about what an infantry person is. An infantryman and now an infantry person is like a frontline type of soldier, and here's a picture of one who looks like they're questioning all their life choices because they're carrying their house on their back like a snail. But historically, these are the frontline soldiers, frontline folks, and that means a little less than it used to because the wars that we fight now don't really have a front line, so it's a little less applicable than it used to be. But within that world, infantry folks still consider themselves to be, quote unquote, the tip of the spear. And if you think of the montage in Forrest Gump of Lieutenant Dan had a descendant die in every single one of the major military conflicts in American history. They were probably infantrymen. And how do you get to be not just an infantry person, but an infantry officer? You have to keep saying yeses. And it's important to recognize that all people in the military have to say a bunch of yeses in this military, in the volunteer military. You're saying yes to the military, you're saying yes to your branch of service, you're saying yes to your MOS, your military occupational specialty. You might be even saying yes to certain duty stations. So you're saying yes to a lot of things, and then at some point they just have you, right? But you can keep saying yeses sometimes, and becoming an infantry officer is one of those things where you just keep saying yes over and over and over. You say yes to the military, say yes to the Army, you say yes to becoming an officer, which means you have to go to college, which people in the Army hate, right? Then you say yes to the infantry, which is actually kind of competitive, or was 20 years ago, to get into as an officer. And then you say yes to all this specialized training that you have to do, like Army Airborne School, and this is what Ranger School looks like, and it's even worse than what that looks like. But you say yes to all those things, and then you get to this point where you're at your unit, and your commanding officer is saying, you got to take this test. You got to be this, I want to see what you are in this personality inventory, right? And what is the type that we think all these 95% of the infantry officers are? They're this person, right? They're the wizard commander, tough-minded, task-oriented, goal-focused, demanding the best from yourself and those around you. You enjoy taking charge of people, achieve strategic goals, so it kind of makes sense the person's even wearing a uniform, right? They look like Napoleon a little bit. Julius Caesar is one of the comps somehow. But anyway, that's apparently what all the young infantry officers are like. And I took the test, and I came back as this. And it was a problem. It was a problem, right? It became kind of like, it became a talking point in my battalion that I had come back as a sensitive, you know. But we're gentle and caring, warm, devoted, nurturing. This is a nightmare, folks. This is not what you want in your infantry officers. You want them to look like this, right? And this, by the way, is the movie in which he said he eats Green Berets for breakfast, but they actually look like assistant professors, the special operations guys, so it's not that impressive. But we're supposed to look like this, right? We're supposed to be the commandos, but folks, this is not the face of a kid who's going to grow up to be a commando. This is not him, right? That's a kid who grows up to be the sweetest in his class. That's what it is. But yet I did say yes to all these things over time, right? I did say yes again and again and again. I did want to become the person who did all those things. And I did them. I made it. I made it to that kind of what I thought was a mountaintop. But then at the end of that, I still found out I was different. But I hope that's making you think about some things related to your threats, because it's important to ask some questions now about why did a kid who was so badly suited for the military decide that was the one and only thing he needed to do with his life. That was the only thing I wanted to do from the time I was about 5 years old until I was about 30 years old. And after that, I had at least a 5-year period where I didn't know what I was doing, right? That's the power of the military on individuals sometimes, because it replaces your small p purpose with a capital P purpose. a small M mission with a capital M mission, and it's really difficult to try to replicate that in any other walk of life. And that's, I think, part of why you see how much veterans hold on to their veteran status, because it's so difficult to find anything else that has that resonance for you as you go forward. So ask yourself the questions about the threads that are getting pulled now as we talk. So the narrative inquiry model, to break it down, there's these things that are called commonplaces, but they're really checkpoints in the research that we look at. We look at, for lack of a better term, to simplify it, when you were, who you were, sociality, and then where you were. So always thinking about when, and I'm interested in people's timelines across the lifespan, not just, a lot of research looks at when they were in combat, veterans, soldiers, sailors, Marine Corps folk, everybody was in combat, what they were doing in combat, but you know, what were the things leading up to it that made them decide they're going to select the military service as a profession? Did things happen to them as kids that made them want to kind of redirect into that, like maybe it did for me? What happened to them after that space? What happened to them after they left the service? Did they have subsequent traumas that then compounded the traumas they'd already experienced? Things like that I'm interested in. So just as an example with me, when you were. Was it when I was a 17-year-old enlisted private in the Army? Or was it when I was a junior military officer, like during the story I just told? Or was it when I was a company commander with an airborne unit toward the end of my career? What part of me are we talking about and when? Because there's a big difference between me at 17 as a private in the Army and me at 28 as a captain and combat veteran of the Army. Those are two different people almost entirely. Or was it when I kind of went off the grid and decided to do my best Thoreau impersonation and lived in a cabin in West Virginia for about a year and just hung out? Was it that time? And was it when I was a wilderness field instructor the last 5 or 6 years, taking kids on trips up in Maine? Was it when I worked for a nonprofit in DC in 2012, 2013, and apparently decided I was never going to eat carbs again? Was it during that time period? Was it when I was practicing Sufism and traveling the world with Sufi leaders trying to understand their religion and faith? Who was I? Who was I? Was I the little boy who was always smiling before his parents got divorced? Was I me now, this exhausted co-parent traveling between cities all the time? Was I when I was a state trooper and still thought it was a good idea to have a uniform and a gun at all times? Or was I a counselor and counselor educator trying to make my way into this profession? And then where was I? Was I on a Sufi commune living in eastern Pennsylvania? Was I in northwestern Washington living at a Buddhist abbey? Was I in Boston studying at the School of Theology and Ministry with the Jesuits? Or was I here at the University of Lynchburg, where I'm going to get this? It's a great day to be a hornet. So I wish she was here. That would be funny. Anyway, so the three common places. This is what we do in narrative research. Why does this subject matter? And now we're coming to a little bit more of it. It matters on a number of levels, and my students, they'll appreciate this. We talk a lot about Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. They're all laughing at me. Horizontal and vertical stressors, right? But it's very important to consider things developmentally and across the lifespan, and then vertical stressors like family patterns, legacies, and traumas. And we now know that trauma genetically is inherited between generations, right? Which is really profound. And also systemically, what's happening on the individual level, and then what's happening in your kind of nuclear family, and then outward, school and work and community, and out to the societal level. So I think it matters on a personal level, I think it matters on a communal level, and I think it matters on a societal level. On a personal level, that picture on the left is one of my participants in this longitudinal study I did, getting his Purple Heart in Vietnam, and he mailed that to me 50 years to the day when it happened. He mailed it to me, and it meant a lot to me that he had remembered me because we had become genuine friends through the research I did. And he wanted me to have that photo, and I know how much that means to veterans to have that kind of photo and let go of it. So on a personal level, I think it matters because we're all footnotes, and many of us will never have the chance to be read. All of us in an unrelenting and desperate struggle for our lives, for the life of a footnote, to remain on the surface before, in spite of our efforts, we're submerged. Everywhere we leave constant traces of our existence, of our struggle against vacuity, and the greater the vacuity, the more violent our struggle. So I'm very interested in footnote people. I'm a footnote person, and I take a lot of pride in the fact that there's five veterans in the world now that their story, in as much depth that I could muster over talking to them for about a year and a half, is always going to be on the internet as long as we have the internet. That means a lot to me that those people's stories now exist in the world, and it's not a small matter to put people's footnotes into the world in that way, I think. On a communal level, I think it matters because we know that veterans disproportionately suffer from things like substance use, suicidality, family dysfunction, et cetera. And that's not to say that's all veterans are, right? Because veterans, I spent a couple of years working in a nonprofit trying to tell people about all the positives and the positive attributes that veterans bring to their communities. They're not just broken people. We have amazing things to offer folks, but we do disproportionately suffer for some of these things. It's just a fact. So if we're interested in helping our veteran community, many of whom are around us and we don't even recognize or know about it, then we have an obligation to kind of work on a communal level toward their betterment. And then on a societal level, I picked out an Oath Keepers picture because they've appropriated a lot of military stuff on their shirts. That's a Ranger tab right there that's made into an Oath Keepers thing. And anybody who's a veteran will also notice that they have the equivalent of a combat patch on their right sleeve, which is a thing you only get if you serve in combat. And so there's a lot of appropriation of military paraphernalia that means a lot to veterans being put onto extremist organization shirts and flags and things of that sort. And I think it just speaks to the larger issue that we're going through right now with the fracturing of our society, where we have a lot of extremists that are recruiting from the veteran ranks, actually. I have a former student who does a lot of work around that they're actually targeting veterans because veterans are coming back and they're looking for that capital P purpose that they're missing. And you could get it there. It's just a very different kind of capital P purpose, right? But if you're a person who always wanted that and always had that sense of mission, then suddenly it could be enticing for you to get pulled in that direction, right? But narrative inquiry helps you kind of hold paradox in your hands, because it can be this thing, it can also be this thing at the same time. And a couple of our researchers said, we believe it's our responsibility as therapists, which we are as well, to cultivate a growing awareness of the dominant stories in our society and to develop ways of collaboratively examining the effects of those stories when we sense them at work in the lives and relationships of the people who consult with us. And then Dr. King talked about it as well. He had a very interesting statement, the madness of militarism. And that's not to suggest that the military itself is at fault for the ways in which it's deployed or used, certainly not the veterans themselves, because the veterans aren't the ones, the service members aren't the ones asking to go to these places, right? It's our government that sends us there, and then veterans get left holding the bill in so many different ways. So, but there is something to consider around that particular subject. So the military experience. I'm going to drink this real quick because I never talk this much, and she made me tea, so. Okay. What better way to talk about it than starting with the Quakers? The Religious Society of Friends, they're a pacifist Protestant church. That means they do not believe in any violence at all, at any time, at all. Here they are at worship with a very transparent and very, very Caucasian Jesus kind of hovering over them. But they do silent worship. So you sit, you don't have clergy, you have no hierarchy. You basically sit in silence, and then if you feel compelled by the Spirit of God within you, you stand up and say something, and then you sit back down. This is what they actually look like. They don't look like the Quaker Oats guy. This is my grandfather, and he's a Quaker, or was a Quaker, and all of my maternal side of my family was Quaker. So they are all very hardcore pacifist folks. And the reason I bring them in, besides the personal component of it, is because they're a really good example of a horizontal organization. They're very big proponents of equality. They were early abolitionists, even in the 1700s. Peace at all costs, sustainability, simplicity, but they have no hierarchy, in other words. They're just a group of people who come together for worship and to have that commonality, and that's it, right? So you juxtapose it against the verticality of the military and other organizations. So vertical organizations And you can see the difference here, right, between a military formation, and that's not even a Quaker meeting, that's a Quaker meeting for business. That's how they do business. They literally sit in a circle in silence until people have something to say. They stand up and say, they sit down. You can imagine how long it takes to get to any kind of resolution when you have that form of communication and decision-making, right? So the difference is kind of like horizontal organizations, in my mind at least, really value the individual members' voices, but it's harder to get things done. And the vertical organizations like the military are designed via their verticality to get stuff done. That is what they do. They go out and they get stuff done. They have a mission and they execute it, but the difference there is that a lot of the individual members in vertical organizations could get trampled underfoot if they're not watched out for by their leaders. So when the leadership fails, people can get, forgotten, or they can get hurt, or they can get left behind. And I don't even mean that in the physical sense, in the metaphorical sense. That can happen a lot to soldiers, sailors, airmen, et cetera. And it comes to a different thing called the relationship regulation model that I talk about a lot as well, via Ray and Fisk. And this is talking about how we find motivation and meaning via social relationship. And the difference between a vertical and horizontal organization is that the authority ranking via hierarchy is really how vertical organizations move. That's how they make meaning. A horizontal organization like the Quakers would do it via equality, matching, and equality. And all of these can be happening at one time together, but generally one of these will be more dominant than the others when you come to an organizational level. So the military is a place where authority ranking is probably the most dominant form of social regulation and relationship. And then to talk about what the military experience entails, I'm not sure there's a perfect way to do it, but I do like talking about it at least with these three elements: the command structure, military identity, and military norms. The military chain of command is both a hierarchy of power and also a social network that determines the authority, responsibility, decision-making, and communication flow. So here's a little device to use to think about this, right? This is a field army kind of organizational chart, right? And all the way down there at the squad level, you might have somebody, and they have no recourse but to go directly up this line, right? Unless it's some kind of outside investigation for which you can get some outside help. But anything that's kind of like a normal-ish thing, you basically have to go from squad to platoon to company, all the way up and down. You are not able to kind of go around and talk to people. The chain of command is taken very seriously in the military. So if you have a problem, you can't go above your next highest leader. You have to talk to that leader directly. So it's a big no-no, for instance, for you to jump a couple of levels. If I had a problem and this was the military, and instead of talking to Daniel or Emma, I went right to the provost, that'd be a problem, right? Then I'd be in real trouble. Daniel would come back and we'd have some issues, right? So you can't do that in the military. You absolutely cannot do that. That's not a thing that's done. So it's very important, the hierarchy and the verticality of it is the structure by which everybody in the military, that's how everything moves up and down that chain. Military norms are the spectrum of values, traditions, beliefs, behaviors, and events connected to military life, including the language that we use to go up and down that chain of command. And if we go back to this picture, it literally looks like an arrowhead, right? And anybody that's been in the military will understand so many things going on here, but even all the flags, you're like, what are all the flags for? Each of those flags represents a unit that has a history that goes back probably hundreds of years. And you could even see little ribbons on the ends of the guidons, the posts with the flags. And each of those little ribbons is a battle, an actual battle that unit fought in. So the military is a historic-centric organization. The history matters a lot to the members. So you have the command structure that's all verticality, and then you have the history of it that is so dominant, and you get taught that in basic training, the history of your units or your branch of service, et cetera. There's so many forms of meaning in something just like a formation. Even thinking about why we have things like formations or drills, or like why are people in these groups standing like this in the military, it's because Baron von Steuben in the Revolutionary War came over from Prussia and taught us taught the revolutionary colonialists how to stand in formation and move in formation, because back then when you had two units kind of facing off 50 meters apart, the unit that moved better and shot faster usually won, right? So close order drill and the ways that military units walk around actually had a lot to do with who won battles 200 or 300 years ago. It doesn't anymore, but it doesn't take away the symbolism and the impact of what that is. And it's still a form of building discipline within the military. And then the identity. It's a traditional warrior ethos, but also defined in its postmodern, meaning post-9/11 manifestation of around-the-clock state of readiness. And that's an important caveat, that the military now is different than it was 25 years ago. It's a lot different. So when I went through basic training, it was pre-9/11, and we were shooting at Russian silhouettes, which is funny because we're now kind of back to that again. But for a long time there in the middle, that seemed very antiquated, right? That was like, okay, everything's different now. 9/11 happened, we have all these new enemies. It's a different world. It's a different world for us. And now you see units, the past 2 decades, especially with Afghanistan, but when both the wars were going on, it was incredibly common for units to go every other year. So you'd come home a year and you'd go a year. You'd come home a year, you'd go home, you'd go back a year. You just keep getting deployed, and it brings a lot of chaos to people's lives, because as soon as you're starting to recalibrate your family, you're gone again. And then you come back and you're a stranger again and again and again, right? I was gone for a year and a half without coming home. And I came home and it was just like nobody even knew me anymore. I didn't know who I was anymore. And so that kind of thing, it happens a lot. The warrior ethos, and these are 3 good examples, I'd say: the Spartans, the Sioux, the Bushido code of the samurai. 3 kind of traditional looks at the warrior ethos, and it's this balancing between aggressive action and self-restraint. But the difference between these cultures and peoples and ours is that these folks were completely integrated into their societies. In fact, some of these societies literally revolved around the warrior ethos of the warrior caste. Our world is completely separate from our military. If you don't know anybody in the military and you didn't serve in the military, you don't know what to do with it, right? It's a complete subculture, distinct and apart from everything else. So it's not as if the military is actually really integrated into our world. It's a very separate entity. And that separateness plays a big factor, I think, in how veterans experience themselves when they come back to the world, because they don't necessarily have the language, and we'll talk about that. They don't have the language to actually process their experiences or talk about them necessarily to people who weren't there and don't understand the same way of communicating that veterans do. So those 3 things. And then the ideal greedy institution. And greedy has a negative connotation, but it doesn't have to be, right? It just means unconditional components, unconditional sacrifice, compliance, cooperation. The military has to be that way because it has a specific mission to fulfill in the world, but that puts an incredible strain on its members, right? That's why there's so many problems for service members and veterans, because of these unconditional components that are asked of them as they're moving through the space. And the research actually does suggest that the military is, in fact, the most ideal greedy institution we have. The verticality of it, the hierarchy of it, the command structure of it, the intense indoctrination in which the self is subsumed by the collective. I mean, the gentleman in the middle is the one from Full Metal Jacket, and the reason he was so good in that role because he was actually a drill instructor. He actually knew what to say and how to treat people to make it authentic, because that's part of the indoctrination process. The yelling and the verbal abuse and what used to be physical abuse was really commonplace because it's part of that indoctrination of taking you away from your own self-identity and subsuming you in the group identity that's so powerful with a capital M mission and the capital P purpose. So you could think of it a little bit like putting a drop of self into the big bucket of the military collective, right? And the different buckets for different missions, different branches of service, different units, things like that. But you go from being this little thing all by yourself to being part of this bucket of water. And then the question really becomes, how do you get out of the bucket? You got to evaporate, and that requires heat and effort, right? And it's hard to get yourself out of the bucket. And that's not even to suggest that everybody wants to get out of the bucket. Because a lot of service members, once they're done with their service and become veterans, I think they get stuck in an in-between place where you kind of want to have a leg in the bucket and you kind of want to be half evaporated. You want to be yourself again and you want to do new things, but you're missing that purpose. You're missing that purpose so much that you had in the military. Add to that hegemonic masculinity, which is a form of dominance and a traditional mode of masculinity that subordinates other forms of masculinity in our culture, and my students will know about this, based on its patriarchal function. The four components: power and ambivalence, and you could even say suppression of the feminine, domination, objectification, and avoidance of emotion, which in the clinical mental health world is a big factor for us, right? The avoidance of emotion at all costs. And so some of these, again, make sense for what the military has to do. The power, the domination, objectification, those are things you need to have in the military in order to make it, in order to fulfill your mission, because mission always comes first. It comes before your people. Mission is the first thing. People are the second. But some of these other factors, they become more problematic after your service is over. So the ways in which you have to avoid emotion when you're in combat, because you can't have a breakdown when you're in the middle of a firefight because people are depending on you, and you can't just start crying and run away, right? So you just suppress all of your fear, you suppress all of your worry, you bury it deep down, and you try to harness your anger because that's the only emotion you're actually allowed to have, and anger is celebrated in the military culture. So then you get used to doing that, and you might even get rewarded for it and celebrated for it. You might be seen as kind of a brave, courageous, heroic type of person in your unit if you do that right. But then you take that form and you try to bring it home, and you don't have access to any of the other parts of your emotional world anymore. It's just the anger. Nothing else is allowed for you. So if we take the bucket analogy, it goes from a drop in the bucket, and then you're trying to evaporate as you get out of the service, and then the hegemonic masculinity stuff is like putting a lid on it, and the drops can't get out a little bit, right? So you're coming up against these pieces where you want to individuate again after your military service. You might not have ever been taught how to do that because you might have joined when you were me and you're 17 and you're not a grown-up, so all you've ever known is the military. And then you come out of it and you're trying to find your way again, and then you kind of bump up against all these internal, metaphorical lids on the pot where you don't have the emotional language and you don't feel like you have emotional permission to kind of express yourself or figure out what's going on for yourself. So, and then last part of that is there is an incredibly caring ethos within the military. The camaraderie is very real in the military. But the catch is you have to belong in order to get it. You can't be an outsider. If you don't meet all of the criteria, you don't get that part of it. So to go back to the original story of the Myers-Briggs, it became a talking point, but I was otherwise accepted by my peers. If I hadn't been accepted by my peers, then I would have been in trouble. Then I would have been ostracized from the unit. So you get pushed out if you don't belong because it becomes a risk. It becomes a security risk to the unit. So going back to the Full Metal Jacket example, the guy who was Private Pyle in that movie, he comes in and he's a problem, and then he's a problem for his platoon mates, and they're getting punished for him. So then they punish him, and then it's a cycle where eventually he breaks and becomes a homicidal, suicidal person. So the ostracization is very real too. If you don't meet all the criteria to be included and experience the camaraderie, then you get pushed further and further away. And that happens a lot too. That happens a lot more commonly than people think. So let's talk about moral injury. The traditional placeholder for it is perpetrating, failing to prevent, or bearing witness to acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. But I prefer this approach, which is the functional approach, which has kind of three parts to it. Morally injurious experience, MIE, moral pain, MP, and then moral injury itself. And so the reasons for a functional approach are that it talks about the functionality of it rather than the symptomology of it. So Fleeing the battlefield is a good example where you might be working with someone, for instance, who feels a lot of guilt and shame over running away from a circumstance where their life was in danger in the military. And you could restructure that from a functional approach and say, well, you literally have a fight or flight mechanism in your body, and your body just decided to fight, right? It doesn't mean you're a coward. It doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean you're, a trash human or whatever the construct is that they're using, because I've heard all of those things from veterans. So you can restructure it to help them understand the functionality of the choices they made. It also allows it to be non-pathologized, which is different than PTSD. PTSD is an actual diagnosis in our DSM-5 Diagnostic Statistic Manual. So it's a thing you could diagnose as a clinician. Moral injury is not. Moral injury from a functional perspective is a painful but ultimately healthy attempt to correct one's moral trajectory, understanding that, and here's the triangle kind of, if you think there's a lot of MIEs, less moral pain, and even fewer actual moral injuries if we go according to the functional model. But it's according to this perception that a moral value has been violated. And the idea is that the shame or guilt you're experiencing is telling you there's a rip in the social fabric and you need to repair the rip, right? That's what your guilt or shame is telling you. It's not telling you you're a bad person. It's telling you need to fix this thing if you can. So an MIE is a situation occurring in a high-stakes environment where an individual perceives an important moral value has been violated by the actions or omissions of self or others. So the first thing there is it has to be a high-stakes environment. Has to be high stakes. That's important. It has to be the perception that one of your moral values has been violated. If you don't perceive a moral value has been violated, then it's not an MIE. And then violated by either the actions or omissions of yourself or others. So it can be a thing that you do. It could be a thing that you fail to do. It could be a thing others do and you fail to stop them from doing. It could be a thing that others fail to do and you allow them not to do, right? It could be all of those things in a high-stakes environment where you're perceiving that there's a moral construct. Moral pain is then when you start to experience dysphoric moral emotions from those experiences. So you have the experiences, and then you have dysphoric moral emotions on top of it. So you're feeling something painful about what was violated or what occurred. And then when it becomes unworkable, that's technically what we would call a moral injury. So you go from having the experiences and the perception of a violation to feeling a certain amount of pain about it to it becoming costly or unworkable, and that is what we would categorize then as a moral injury. Again, lots of MIEs, and then fewer experiences of moral pain, and then fewer experiences of moral injury. But how is it relevant? A third of service members, according to one study, believe their most difficult combat experience was an event of moral injury, and then almost half of combat vets claim exposure to at least one type of MIE during combat. So it's pretty significant in terms of the experiences that our combat members are having. And then if you have an immoral appraisal of combat, it predicts distress beyond the exposure to combat alone, which is kind of self-explanatory. But if you're asking yourself questions of morality around your combat experiences, it's going to make it harder for you than if you're like, nothing moral there to consider. They're more at risk if you've had an MI. You're more at risk for self-injurious thoughts and behaviors, which we know suicidality is an issue with our service members. And then within those categories of moral injury, if you take human life, so if you kill, and also if there's acts of abusive violence, which is a specific form of violence, that increases the risk for depression and PTSD among soldiers. So there's all kinds of overlap between moral injury and PTSD. And I won't get into the details of this particular equation model that was done, but it ended up telling us that there are different constructs that are overlapping and related. And the big distinction is kind of between natural or primary emotions, as they're called, like fear, panic, etc., or manufactured emotions like shame and guilt. So it looks a little bit like this, where you could be all the way on the PTSD side and you could be all the way on the moral injury side. And a lot of people are in the middle. A lot of people have experiences in the military, outside of the military, with both of these things. And it gets a little bit fuzzy because some of the criteria under moral injury fall into the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, but it's important to kind of suggest, according to the research, that they are actually distinct entities. So if I'm talking to a veteran about, some of my startle reflexes, we're talking about trauma. If I'm talking to them about the ways that I feel guilt and shame over things that happened for me in the war, we're talking about moral injury. If we're talking about the ways in which I'm pissed off or angry or sad about all of the things that happened combined, we're probably talking about something in the middle. So it's a helpful construct to just consider it as like a Venn diagram of overlapping but separate constructs. Some of the ways in which they're connected. PTSD symptomology and its progression is mediated by moral emotions. Acts of personal transgression have an impact on the course of PTSD development. Moral injury can challenge your basic sense of humanity. It can evoke a spiritual existential crisis. It can result in negative changes in ethical attitudes and behaviors. What do we do about it? Lots of things to be done about it, but the same folks who came up with the functional definition came up with this moral healing explanatory process that we can use in our clinical mental health counseling work. And I highlighted a couple of these, and I think any vets here will understand this, but one of the worst things you could do with veterans is tell them they're not responsible for their actions. So it's really important that we help them accept the reality of their past mistakes and past moral wrongs without kind of passing the buck to other people, even if other people have some responsibility, right? There's a way to help them understand maybe it wasn't all their fault, but they don't want you to tell them none of it was your fault, right? Not when it comes to moral injury, because they understand they had some culpability in what happened, and because they're service members and veterans, they generally don't want to not take responsibility. If anything, the thing they tend to do is take all the responsibility. So you have to help them kind of contextualize it to say, well, here's what the leaders did, right? And here's the position you were put in, and it was an impossible choice between these two things, and you have some culpability, but also all these other things, right? So you try to help them contextualize it without saying they have no responsibility for something at all. And among these other things to consider, actively helping them live into the values, especially the values that might have been violated, is important. So if somebody felt like their integrity was violated and they made a choice that cost somebody a life, for instance, you try to help them rebuild their integrity in the present, because we can't fix the past, but we can help them live into a future where they reclaim some of those values that were violated for them during their service time. So the study I did was titled The Longitudinal Impact of Moral Injury on Combat Soldiers, a Narrative Inquiry Study. And I wanted to look at military occupational specialty. I wanted to look at combat soldiers and the ways that combat soldiers were affected across the lifespan related to moral injury. And just some statistics that I found, or actually calculated, but only 3 Americans out of every 10,000 will serve as infantry soldiers in the military, either in the Marine Corps or in the Army, which I think is pretty profound. They're very few. And I wanted to look at their experiences. I wanted to see, does getting trained in a combat job versus a different type of job, if everybody goes through basic training, but then if you're a truck driver, you go to truck driving school. If you're a cook, you go to cook school. But if you're an infantry person, you go to the infantry school. So you go through basic training, and then after you learn how to use weapons in basic training, you basically go to infantry training and you learn how to use weapons even better. That's kind of your job, right? You just use weapons and try to kill people. And I wanted to know if they have the same sense of kind of moral ambivalence that maybe other service members have around their experiences in wartime. So I ended up finding 5 folks, and I worked with them for 6 months of continuous contact, but I was in touch with these guys for about a year and a half. And I talked with each of them probably the equivalent of about 20 hours each. And we had 3 states represented. We had 3 wars represented: Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, second Iraq and Afghanistan. And the data collection process was a lot of interviews, personal journaling, documentation, then transcripts. I went to an outside PTSD and trauma expert in the military and got his feedback and came back with that. And then I member checked with each of these gentlemen. We would meet again, and I'd go there with all of my notes and all of my transcripts and say, would you mind reading these and giving me feedback? And so it was member checked in a way that confirmed their stories that they had told previously to me. And then it's consolidated and made anonymous and then committee approved. And these are the 5 gentlemen, and they were really remarkable people. The first guy, Aaron, was a person who suffered moral injury after combat. So he had been on a training mission, and they had taken the .50 caliber gun off of this Humvee turret, and it fell and hit him in the head on a training mission in the States. And then his commander basically decided he didn't want to call a medevac because he'd get in trouble. And so they threw him in the back of a truck and tried to like quietly evac him via truck rather than helicopter, and he almost died. And he ended up partially paralyzed for a while, and then has had incredible complications ever since then. So he had this experience of kind of institutional betrayal, which is a real form of moral injury that I talk a lot about, institutional betrayal by inept leadership and people trying to cover their own butts because they don't want to get bad reviews and stuff. Rich had also a very interesting story. He was an infantryman who kept deploying. He kept volunteering for new units. And at one point, he was overseas for almost 3 consecutive years, which is pretty unprecedented, without coming back. And then he got injured. He got blown up, and he came home wounded. And then they filled him with opioids because it was about 2010, and they thought you could still do that. And then he became an opioid addict and spent about 7 or 8 years getting clean. And then pursued his PhD after that. Really remarkable story. Joe was in the 10th Mountain Division, which was my unit, and he also became a cop like me afterward, except he was really good at it. And he had a lot of experiences like I did as a police officer, where your trauma is coming up for you as you're trying to do the work, and that's pretty much why I left police work. I couldn't do it. I couldn't put my hands on people anymore. I couldn't pull my weapon when I needed to. I was all over the place. I went right into police work after active duty military. I was a mess. So he had the same experiences, but was able to work through it and process it. Ken was my first Vietnam vet, and he was just leveled by Agent Orange, which we'll talk a little bit about. But Agent Orange that they put on the foliage in Vietnam to destroy the foliage to say they could see the trails that the North Vietnamese army were using, is full of cancer-forming stuff, for lack of a better term. And so he's riddled with various forms of cancer. He might not even be alive now, I'm not sure. But he was immobile, and a lot of our talks were about his illnesses and the things that had happened to him. And again, that sense of institutional betrayal by the people who should be taking care of you, that all of our Vietnam veterans came back with Agent Orange exposure, among all these other horrific things that they went through. And then Dick was my other Vietnam veteran. He'd been married 6 times. He'd had a lot of problems after the service, a lot of substance use, a lot of issues. And it was so interesting talking to the Vietnam vets and getting almost 50 years at that point, 50 years of stories that were post-service stories about what happened to their lives and how their lives came completely unraveled, that generation. And we'll talk about some of the reasons for that, but really remarkable to hear their stories and to spend so much time with these individuals over a couple of years. And I love this quote: "Nothing is whole or of a single piece. Everything is fractured and envenomed. Veins of peace run through the body of war, and hatred insinuates itself into love and compassion. There is truce amid the quagmire bullets and a bullet amid the revelries. Nothing can bear to be unique or prevail or be dominant, and everything needs fissures and cracks, needs its negation at the same time as its existence, and nothing is known with certainty, and everything is told figuratively." So if we come back to temporality, sociality, and place, some of the things that came out of the study that I've already mentioned, but the generational divide was huge between the Vietnam service members and the younger service members because they were conscripts, they were draftees, they didn't have a choice. Both of those gentlemen were pulled out of their communities and their homes and forced into active service as infantry soldiers. They weren't people who said yes to anything. So the difference between our current volunteer force, where people are saying yes over and over to get to where they want to go, and what happened to the Vietnam generation, where a lot of them did not want to go at all. But the interesting thing there is once they were in the military, both of them were saying yes to go with their units to places they weren't required to. So they didn't want to be draftees, and they didn't want to go in the service. But once they were trained and had been indoctrinated and brought into that space of the great capital P purpose and capital M mission, they didn't want to leave their units behind. Both of them had opportunities not to deploy to Vietnam, but they said yes anyway, because they didn't want to leave their comrades and not go. And it cost them a lot to go. It cost them a lot. Time heals and time hurts. Not everything heals over time. In fact, for the Vietnam generation, a lot of things got quite a bit worse. And even for the Iraq and Afghanistan veterans that I worked with, they're not necessarily doing better just because time has passed. A lot of the complications that they're experiencing around moral injury, around post-traumatic stress, around traumatic brain injury, around all these other complications, physical ailments and problems we all have, those things tend to get worse. My body is way worse than it was 10 years ago. And that's a thing that just happens over time because of the wear and tear you put on it in the service. The Agent Orange is a thing that both the Vietnam vets were dealing with. They both had cancer. Both of them had been connected to Agent Orange exposure. Really, really sad. Moral injury before and after combat, and then memory as an unreliable narrator. Their memories within combat were very, very clear and always the same. But their memories outside of combat were sometimes different. So it was useful to ask them the same stories of 6 times, 10 times, because you'd eventually kind of carry the thread forward, thinking of the threads again, that made the most sense and were most relevant. But they never didn't know what they were talking about related to their combat experiences, which if you've been in combat makes sense, because it's all crystal clear. It's all perfectly vivid for the rest of your life, but everything outside of that is where you kind of lose yourself. The sociality piece, how we experience ourselves and one another as combat vets. The vet-to-vet research piece was, I thought, really important. I don't think any of these guys would have talked to me if I wasn't a combat veteran, if I wasn't a combat infantry veteran either, because I had to have certain bona fides to get through the door with them. They don't want to just talk to a counselor. That's, that's again, back to the hegemonic masculinity stuff, right? They want to talk to somebody who's been in their shoes and knows what it's like and isn't going to judge them for some of the things that maybe they did, not understanding the power of the military compulsion and discipline and order and the things that you have to do to survive, right? So I think it made a big difference for me to come from that world and then be in this world where I can kind of straddle the line between the spaces. And the warrior identity I referenced, but folks, when they are in active duty versus reserve duty, and the difference that makes you feel like you're more part of the action, you really feel more like a soldier when you're on active duty versus reserve duty, and then the shock of being in reserve duty and getting deployed and suddenly you're on active duty, which happened to a lot of reservists and National Guard folks in the last 20 years. They were just doing their normal drill once a weekend every month, and then 2 weeks in the summer, and then suddenly you're overseas and fighting. And that was one of the units we replaced in Iraq, was a reservist unit that had been decimated because they came over unprepared and then basically didn't do anything for the next year because they were too afraid to leave. And then connectivity and loss around that sense of camaraderie you lose when you're trying to pull yourself out of the bucket. You might want to do it, but you're also losing pieces of yourself as you go, and you're no longer surrounded by 30 friends, That was the one beautiful kind of continuity piece between the military and the police force, was it felt like you still had all these friends. And then you leave that and you're like, oh, wow, I'm really alone, and you can't go back to it, it's gone for good. And then the places we were. Dr. Edward Tick, who's the expert that I referenced before that I would use to kind of member check things, he talked about he travels to Vietnam every single year to interview North Vietnamese soldiers from the Vietnam War. And he says moral injury doesn't exist there because they're just like, we are defending our homeland. We have nothing to feel morally ambiguous about at all. And whether or not that's true isn't really the point as much as the idea of what it means to be part of an invading force versus a force that's maybe defending home and hearth. And the psychological difference between those things, I think, is quite substantial. And I was thinking about this the other day as I was putting this together, but, a few thousand soldiers and, folks in our service in the military died in the Iraq War that I was a part of, 4,000 or 5,000. It's immensely sad, but then I think about it, I'm like, well, the conservative estimates are at least 100,000 Iraqis died, at least, right? That's a lot of people, and it makes you think about the choices we make as a nation to put people into these spaces where you're not just putting our citizens and service members in harm's way. All these people who are just going about their daily lives end up caught in the middle and become collateral damage. It's incredibly sad, and you see it in the war too. You see how often people get caught in the middle of things and how often people who are just trying to live their lives end up getting killed. So, and a sense of forwardness and otherness related to both being overseas and then related to our experiences in our larger culture, where you always feel like you're apart from people, and you could never quite feel like you belong anymore because all of these things have happened to you, but nobody's asking you about it. And there's this great paper called The Combat Veteran Paradox that talks about all the ways that combat veterans walk around as paradoxes. They want people to ask, but they don't want to talk about it. You know, you want to be recognized, but you just want to be anonymous. So this constant like push and pull of wanting certain things and wanting pieces of recognition, but then being like, I just was doing my job. So there's this constant kind of back and forth in trying to figure out where you want to fit in the larger world. And then the two places that always came up were 9/11 for my generation of veterans. That's the departure point for everything that happened afterward. And then the Vietnam Wall for the Vietnam vets was an incredibly powerful place that they talked about. They both had gone on the hero flights where they were flown to the wall to go experience it for themselves. And they were both really skeptical about it when it was built, because it was built by an Asian American woman, an Asian American architect. And a lot of Vietnam vets were not happy with that because they had carried forward a lot of their prejudices from the conflict. And so they're like, why is an Asian person making our wall, right, making our memorial? And then she made one of the most beautiful and shockingly vivid representations of war ever created. And it really is, I used to walk by it every day when I lived in D.C. and worked in D.C. And every day you would see a Vietnam vet sitting there crying outside that memorial. Every single day there'd be somebody. They had park rangers assigned just to comfort people who were coming out of that space. Because it's like you go down this kind of tunnel and the wall just starts to rise up around you and there's all the names in black. And it's just a really vivid, shocking experience. I never saw it on a day when there wasn't a non-vet there just all shook up and upset about it. So some of the extrapolations from the study: loss of ideals, combat prejudices, faith and spirituality came up a lot. Near-death experiences, that was something I had in common with a couple of the participants. So talking about the ways in which everybody has close calls and just happenstance and circumstance and things that they were just a little bit different. You know, I had an NCO, a sergeant, call me off a road one time, and then the road blew up behind me, and I had a really good friend who switched places with me on a convoy, and then he got killed. Things like that happened a lot, and a lot of that happened to my participants too. They had near calls. That Ken, one of the Vietnam vets, had done the same thing. He had jumped off a convoy, and the convoy had been ambushed, and everybody had been killed. And then empathy and compassion for everybody who serves, for the people we fought against. That was a thing that I really resonated with Dick, the other Vietnam vet, about. He had lost a real good friend who was a North Vietnamese, I guess turncloak is the term, although I don't love that word, but had become a thing called a Kit Carson Scout, which is a former North Vietnamese soldier who becomes a South Vietnamese scout for American-led units. And this guy actually saved the unit a whole bunch of times. He was an incredible soldier and ended up getting killed. And it resonated for me because I had all of these Iraqis who helped us. We had 4 Iraqi interpreters who lived with us, worked with us, ate with us, fought with us, and all 4 of them got killed eventually. And a couple of them got murdered too. They were home on leave and got found out because it was considered, you know, really bad policy to be working with the Americans. So there's all these interesting kind of overlaps between my experiences and their experiences. And then societal, professional, and personal reasons, as I outlined at the beginning, I thought it was a unique study. I thought it had value in its untold stories of individual people. It was plausible, it was adequate, it was authentic. Nobody was an outlier. These are just normal soldiers with normal experiences. If I had taken 5 other people from that swath of folks, it probably would have been a lot of similar things told, similar obstacles, similar things overcome. So I thought it had a lot of value from that perspective. And then research as art, I like to think of narrative inquiry as an art form. It's really storytelling on a research kind of level. And I find it beautiful to just talk to people about their stories. It's what we do in counseling too. We just listen to people's stories and let them talk and try to help them make meaning of what they've been through in life. And so narrative inquiry to me is a really, really beautiful model of how to do that and also bring some value into the research space apart from simply telling the stories. So as we become aware of ourselves as storytellers, we realize we can use our stories to heal and make ourselves whole. And I'll finish with another story. I make some of my students take this. I made Daniel take this, and my fiance. But the Sparketype test is actually a really good test. It has millions and millions of data points. And you take it to figure out what motivates or drives you. You can find it at the Good Life Project online. And so you have a primary type, you have a secondary or shadow type that kind of pushes your primary type forward, and then you have an anti-type. And I took this thing a couple of years ago, and of course I was a nurturer, and then my secondary type was the advisor, and then of course my anti-type was the warrior. And so I was pissed off for probably like 72 hours. And I was really upset about it, and I'm like, I'm so tired of being this person, like I really don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to be a nurturer. I don't want to help people anymore. I want to, and how dare they tell me I'm an anti-warrior? But it's not really about the military. It's about leading folks and what motivates you, right? So I try not to take it personal. But after that, I kind of realized, like, well, that maybe it's okay for me to be this person. It's okay for me to be a different type of human who maybe can help connect people to resources and talk to veterans in ways that maybe a lot of veterans don't get those chances to have those conversations. So maybe that's okay. Maybe I'm like a fully integrated healer helper person at this point in time, or maybe I'm just a wanderer according to the Jungian archetype. That's this young, not that young, who's still trying to find his place and it carries his woundedness with him. Maybe I'm becoming a martyr through the counseling cause, where there's this strain of martyrdom through the military, through religiosity, and a lot of us carry it too in the healing professions, where we're basically sacrificing ourselves at the altar of other people's wellness. And I talk to my students a lot about burnout and compassion fatigue and trying to take care of yourself and put yourself first, because there is a tendency for us to put ourselves last and to put our families last and to bring nothing home with us but just, saltiness, right? So maybe I'm that too, or maybe I'm just a professor who's in over his head a little bit. But you get to decide what the threads are for me. You get to decide them for yourselves. You get to decide the threads for all of the veterans and service members that you might know or in your family or will be coming into your world in the future. Thinking about their stories, thinking about your stories and the ways that they're interwoven and intersect. That's the value of what I try to do as a researcher, as a clinician, as a teacher, as a friend. So that's it. Thanks for your time. Any questions?
We'll open the floor for questions.
Yeah.
Yes, I have a question.
Okay.
So, as I hear your identity and where it has cultivated yourself for the last 12 years, you made an insight that said how good it was that you were a vet to be able to talk to other vets.
Yeah.
Is there a place, is there a relationship, is there a causality for one that has not been a vet to be able to come alongside vets to help them?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think in the same ways that a veteran would do it, which is just to lead with listening and empathy, and letting them tell their stories before we kind of jump to any conclusions. But I had a really profound experience with a professor when I was thinking of doing a doctorate, and I went for a visiting day to William and Mary, and this professor, she was asking me what I wanted to do, and I was like, well, I'd like to work with veterans because I'm a veteran, and I feel like veterans really need to work with veterans. And she was like, that's actually really wrong. And she broke it down for me, the ways in which it actually isn't. You don't need to be a veteran to work with vets at all. It's a space open to we're all humans, and I think just leading with that space of allowing people to tell you their stories without putting any of our judgments or calculations on it is the best way to go about connecting with vets if you're not one. Yeah.
Because the vets are looking at this for themselves and saying, I mean, are they saying, I want a vet? Or are you saying that there's an openness to vets saying, you know, I can see some value that someone else could bring?
It's a great question. I think that it's both. I think some vets really do want to work with a vet. I have veteran clients as a clinician who found me just because I'm a veteran. That's it. That's the only criteria they looked at. They didn't care what I went to school for. I could be I could be doing astrology or something. They wouldn't care, just that not that there's anything wrong with that, but, that I'm just a veteran, right? That's all they care about. And there's other veterans, I think, that are really open to the possibility of talking to folks who don't have that experience and are ready to be more open, and maybe actually need someone who's not a veteran because they feel like, again, going back to some of the hegemonic masculinity stuff, they might feel like they can't talk to me in a certain way or be open with me in a certain way if they know that I have that background. They might be ashamed of coming to that clinical space and opening themselves up to another veteran. So a lot of them might actually be seeking something really foreign from their veteran experience in order to have a very foreign kind of emotional experience as well. Yes.
I have two questions.
Great.
I do not come from a military background at all. And when I worked at a hospice in North Carolina years ago, there was this big push to work with veterans because World War II veterans were passing so quickly. And so that kind of opened my eyes to a lot of it. And one day I thanked a veteran for their service, and he turned around and he's like, what are you thanking me for? Do you have any idea what I did? And if you knew what I did, you probably wouldn't thank me. And I said, well, thank you for following your orders. Thank you for your bravery. And thank you for continuing to get out of bed every day. I didn't know what to say, and to this day, when I see veterans, I want to say thank you because you've done something that I can't even comprehend. But saying thank you for your service also seems very disingenuous.
Yeah.
And so what would be a helpful response, or nothing, or what? And the other question is, when the veterans are coming home, I mean, warfare is so totally different. I mean, look at the embassies and the members down there that were being bombarded by these sounds and vibrations. It's like, how do you even prepare anyone to come back into the real world or the civilian world after those kinds of experiences on all levels?
Yeah. Good questions. Yeah. I think to the first, I guess the thing to first acknowledge is it's kind of an impossible position for people. I really don't know the perfect answer because I think it comes from a genuine place usually when people say thank you for your service. And sometimes it feels disingenuous, but generally I find it respectful and appreciate it. And I think that just comes down to the individual veteran and whether or not they're having a good day or a bad day maybe or something like that. But I like it too when folks kind of ask if they can thank me, which is strange. That's another strange, but like some people once in a while will be like, is it okay if I thank you for your service? And I'm like, sure, and I kind of appreciate that ask without presuming that it's a thing to be thanked, because there are veterans who don't want that experience. So that might be one small suggestion, but really it's a tough spot for people because I think it comes from a good place and not all veterans like it, and it goes back a little bit to that paradox of like they want the acknowledgement, but they don't want it at all, and if they accept it, then it means they're not just being a soldier, right? So it's kind of, it puts everybody else in a tough position in terms of what to say or what to do with it. But I think that asking if it's okay to thank them, or maybe asking them further questions after thanking them in terms of what they did, or, what branch of service were they in, what job did they have, where did they serve, that kind of thing, so that it doesn't feel disingenuous. You're suddenly asking real questions about their service, and what they did would be a useful follow-up to the initial statement. And to the second point, I just lost my train of thought. What was this? Remind me of the second one again. That you.
Face of warfare.
Oh, yeah, coming home, yeah. I mean, reintegration is a huge problem for vets. That's like the biggest, I think, juncture point. It's when you come back, and maybe not right when you come back, but when you leave the service. If you leave active duty, for instance, that seems to be the departure point where you suddenly have a lot of problems because you lose your support network. If you're an enlisted soldier and you've spent, a decade enlisted in the Army, for instance, you've never paid rent, right? You've never had to buy food. I had soldiers when I was an officer who would come back from a weekend and be like, how was your weekend? I'd be like, oh, great, sir, I got a car. And I'd be like, well, you got a car? And then their payment would be, so they didn't have anything left over from their paycheck for gas, right? It was their whole paycheck plus like $10 for their car payment, and they didn't understand basic kind of functions in life because they'd never had to do anything. If you join the military when you're 17, they're going to do all those things for you. And so you have to figure out how to be an adult again, maybe for the first time, and you also lose all of your support network around you with all the people in your unit who support you and your friends, and you go probably back to your hometown or someplace where there's not a lot of people who understand what you've been through, and it's a really hard transition. And I don't really have an answer for necessarily how to make it better other than, encouraging folks to talk about it, encouraging them to be open about it, and, trying to find a counselor if they're okay with that, or a therapist, or at the very least a vets group that maybe they could get reconnected with, things like Team Red, White, and Blue, vets groups that go running, for instance, and do physical activities. They're in almost every major city. There's nonprofits all over the place for vets. So even if they're not comfortable talking about their feelings, there's lots of ways for them to get involved with other veterans now that didn't exist, 30, 40 years ago. There's tons of resources now. So I would direct them to that.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
I saw on one of your slides, you were talking about the difference between the active component and the reserve components. When you start talking about this reintegration piece, one of the things, full disclosure, I've been deployed 5 times, 3 with the active duty, twice with the Guard. And I think probably the hardest part of that is for Guardsmen, they come back, and reservists, they come back, and where the active component has everything still right there for them.
Yeah.
The National Guardsmen and reservists come back to a town of 300 people.
Yeah.
Where nobody knows what they just did.
So true.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? And how do we, and I guess maybe it goes more into a sociological question than a psychological or a counseling question, is what do you think a good answer is for that, to help those soldiers deal with that?
That's such a good question. Yeah. I was in one of those National Guard units too, It's crazy, right? It's definitely crazier for them because they're plucked out of that world and they're plucked right back into it, and it's just so jarring. I don't really have a good answer besides, the growing hope that there are a lot of new veterans organizations on the grassroots level that are really helping vets in these smaller communities. When I was working in DC, I was in touch with a lot of these kind of local agencies and organizations that were doing really good work. But there's so much more to be done, and you know how the VA is. It's kind of hit and miss. And sometimes it's really good and sometimes it's non-existent, and it really just depends on the organizational leadership and who's there and how serious they're taking the work. I really wish I had a better answer because it is a big problem. Yeah. But I'll just hype our program for a second. We are trying to run a veteran-led counseling clinical kind of retreat space for reintegration here at the Claytor Nature Center next spring. Dr. Hall and I are going to run that. So hopefully we applied for a grant. I hope we get it. And if we get it, then we're going to try to get about a dozen participants who are, partially to just recreate that sense of camaraderie and bonding that you have amongst veterans, and, just have a day of it and talk about stuff and figure out some things that we can do that are subtly clinical but not overtly clinical, and you know what I mean, and we'll figure it out. So I hope we get the grant. Yeah.
Thank you all for joining us this evening. It's been wonderful. If I could give Dr. Gosling just a couple of tokens of our appreciation. Here's
Oh, thank
the
you.
name of your
Oh, wow.
talk.
That's so lovely.
And just a little gift bag.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
It's been
Thank
great.
you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for coming.
And in case you guys didn't know, I am an ENFP, so we're basically the same person.
That's true. We are.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.